Now we're going to look at variables. And to get us started, we need to create a file here first. I'm going to try and make sure that with each concept that you explain, we're going to have a separate file for it, just for organization purposes and also so that I don't end up deleting most of the things as we go. So I'm going to create a file name here, and I'll just call it variables.js. And inside of this is where we're going to talk about variables. So I've mentioned the word variable so many times, but what is a variable really? So I'd like you to think of a variable as a container. Just think of it as a container for storing data. And a container for storing data, here it could be any sort of values. So any data values that you can either read and also update at the same time. So just think of it as a container. That should be enough to just help you understand what variables are. Now, when you talk of variables, there are a number of ways that we can basically work around with variables. Now, to because we're already using a JavaScript file, how you would declare a variable is you use a let keyword. So there are multiple keywords that you can use, but let keyword is one of those. You say let, then followed by the name of the variable. So you can call a variable anything. So let's say for now I just call the variable x, then you assign it a value. So you use an equal sign to assign it a value. Now, what you can see here, the fact that we used an equal sign, this does not mean equality. All this means is that we are assigning the value 5 to the variable x. So this is an assignment operator. When you use it, just a single equal sign is an assignment operator. Then once you do this, you can go ahead and print it out. So you can just say console.log, then you just pass in the name of the variable. And if you go ahead and let's do this. If you go ahead and run the code, I'm going to just call you say node followed by the name of the file, which is variables.js. Then when you hit enter, as you can see, it prints out 5, and 5 is the variable that we declared earlier on here. So you use the let keyword, then you declare, you pass in, you give it the name of the variable, the assignment operator, then the value that you are assigning to that specific variable. This is pretty important to understand it this way, and also simply how you run your code. So now x, which is the variable name, is a container for the value 5, which is just again to repeat on this, a variable is a named container for storing data values that you can either read or update, or you can also read and update at the same time. Now, let's talk about declaration, because for now I've just mentioned the let keyword and that is basically it. But I'd like us to just dive a little bit inside into what these kinds of declarations mean. So note that when you say let x, let me just explain this one more time. When I say let x, that means I have declared a variable x. Then I can now give x a value like 5. So you can be able to split it down like this. So what this first is going to be, this is variable declaration. So you just call this variable uh, declaration like that. Then in this case, when you give it a value, this is now initialization. So we have variable declaration and variable initialization. And you can now combine the two, which is now basically variable initialization, declaration initialization. So let me just do this. When you do it like that, that is variable initialization and declaration. So I'll just add a comment here and I'll just say initialization and declaration. Okay, so this is it with variables. Now let's go into the specific keywords, how you declare the variables. So to declare the variables, there are three keywords that are usually used. One, you can use var. Then we also have let, which you've just seen. Then we have const at the same time. Now I'm going to explain each of them and what that means. When you're talking about var, let's start with var. The var keyword, this was mainly used before ES6. So ES6 is a newer version of JavaScript, but before ES6, the var keyword was used mainly to initialize and to basically declare variables. The scope of this, when you talk about scope, what you mean is the area with which it covers. So we're going to talk about this later on, but I'd like you to think of it as when you have something in a box. When you have something in a box, think of think of this as a box, right? When you have something in a box, so let's say you have some numbers within this box, then they're working with those numbers are only available and can only be accessed within the box, right? So if you're within your house, right, and you switch on the lights in your house, the lighting is only available within the house, right? So you want, if you go to the rooftop or outside your house, whatever lighting that is inside the house is not available outside, right? So if it is at night, it will be dark outside and there'll be light inside your house, right? So that is what we refer to as scope. The scope of the light that you've the bulb, let's say, within your house, the scope is within that room where it is being lit. Then outside, now think of it as when the sun comes up in the morning, right? When the sun comes up, the light is can be basically be accessed anywhere, right? So it's basically global, right? The scope of the sun is global, but the scope of the bulb within your house is just within that room where that bulb is. I hope that analogy does make sense. Now, when you're using the var keyword, its scope is global, right? What that means is that the variable name, whatever value you give it there, can be accessed anywhere. So it is also within a function. We're going to talk about functions later on. Now, the other thing about when you're using a var keyword is that a var keyword, you can be able to reassign a value to it. So it is the same as the let keyword. So for example, if I use a var, I just say var, then let's say I declare a variable called y and I give it a value 10, right? Then I'm going to come here and print out 10 y. So I'll just say console.log y. And if we come here and run our code, you can see we get 10, right? Now, what you mean by reassignment is I can take the variable y and assign it a new value like 34. And what this is going to mean is that now the new value of y is 34. If I run this, you see that it prints out 34 here on the terminal in the console. So this is what we mean by reassignment. So a variable had already been declared and initialized with the value, but you can reassign the value to change it. The same happens with the let keyword as well. You can do this similar reassignment to it. Now, the reason why we don't use the var keyword anymore it's not advisable for you to use it in the current and newer versions of JavaScript is because of the way it is hoisted, right? So in this case, whenever once you use the var keyword, you can sort of be able to access a value, not really access, but it doesn't raise an error if you try to access a value that you haven't declared. So think of it like you are able to access funds in your bank account, but you don't have funds yet in your bank account, right? So as you can see, that is not something good. So for example, just to show you what we mean here, I'm going to try and console. I'm going to console.log y, right? Note that I'm trying to print it out before I've even declared it, and I'm going to just comment this one out. And okay, let me just comment this one out as well, so we can deal with the one on line 7 alone. I'll clear this up and run the code again. So whenever I run it, you can see it just tells me that this is undefined. What this means is that I'm trying to access something that I have not defined yet, but it is not raising an error, right? So think again of it. You are trying to access funds that don't exist in your bank account, but it does not give you an error notification telling you that you don't have any funds, or this is an operation you cannot do because you have no funds in your account. Right? So that is not something good. So this is what is happening here. It's supposed to raise an error, or rather you expect it to raise an error when you try to clear something that you haven't. In a smaller program like this one, it doesn't have much harm, but think of it as when your program is really, really complex and you have so many lines of code, then you have something like this, a condition like this somewhere in your code, and it doesn't raise an error, but it ends up affecting the way your program operates. But if you try to do that with the let, so I'm going to just try and console.log X right here. If we run the code, you'll see that it automatically raises an error, and it even tells you these are reference error. You cannot access X before initialization. That is very important. So that being said, Now, my point here is that we do not use the var keyword anymore as much as it is still available within JavaScript. So we mainly use the let keyword, and then we also use the const keyword. The good thing about the let keyword, note that when I mentioned that the scope is global for the var keyword, but with the let keyword, the scope is within the block where it has been declared. So, right, so you can be able to just access it within a specific aspect. Okay, we talked about blocks when you're talking about the introduction and to JavaScript. Basically, you said this is like a block. So if you declare let in here, it is only accessible within this block, and it cannot be accessed outside. But var can be accessed outside a specific block like that. The other keyword we use is known as a const keyword. So as you've already guessed it, const stands for constant. And what this means is that the variable that you declare, let's say I say const name, and a given name. So this is how you declare names. For now, let me actually just use a number still. So I say const, let's say k, and give it a value like 20. What this means when you're using const here, let's start to console.log first. Console.log k, and if I run the code, let's do that again. You see it prints out 20, right? But if I try to do rather to reassign k, so let's say I reassign it with 20, not 20, 27, it's not going to allow that. As you can see, it raises a type error and it says assignment to a constant variable. What that means is that you're not allowed to rather reassign a value to a constant value. So constant, that means you're maintaining exactly what is being mentioned here. Now, one of the main things we need to also mention as you are talking about these variables and how you can declare them and everything else is the concept of hoisting, right? So I've mentioned a number of things here that are sort of related to, rather that are related to hoisting directly. So, for example, I've mentioned that whenever you, rather, we have even seen this one when you're trying to console.log a value that has been a variable that has been declared by the keyword var, and it gives you undefined instead of an error. The reason for this is what we refer to as, let me just write it here, what a concept that is known as hoisting. And this is what hoisting is. So hoisting is the behavior in JavaScript whereby whenever you declare any declarations that you make, so declaring variables in this case, it moves to the top of the scope before the code is executed, right? What that means is that whatever program that you write, any sort of declarations that you have, they are moved to the top of the scope before initialization. So it applies to variables, it applies to functions, it applies to classes, which are concepts we're going to look at later on. What it basically means is that you can reference these declarations that you've made before those declarations are defined in your code. But there's some caveats that are also set, of course, in that case. That is why when we're using the var keyword, we were able to still sort of access it in a way, but it gave us a return of undefined. That is the concept of hoisting. It's because it has been moved to the top of the execution, right? It's the same thing happens to functions as well. You can be able to call a function before the function is declared, and it's not going to sort of raise that many errors. So I believe that is clear there. The other concept here related to hoisting that I'd like to explain is the concept of what we refer to as a temporal. Let's call it a temporal dead zone. Should be zone here. And a temporal dead zone, I'm going to just remove this equal sign just because yeah. So a temporal dead zone is also an area, refer to it as, just think of it as an area of a block where the variable that you've declared cannot be accessed until the moment whereby the computer initializes that value. The simplest way to put it is we've been using the let keyword and the const keyword, and you've seen that whenever you're using them, you cannot be able to access, for example, you cannot access k right before you declare it. So you have to declare it first and then access it on the line below. In that case, it is in a temporal dead zone. What that means is that that variable is inaccessible until it has been initialized with a value. That is very important. It has to be initialized with a value. So what that means is that, for example, if I do this, let's you just declare k, then you can actually even see we already have an error that has been raised there. But you just run the code, you see we still get a syntax error, missing initializer, const declaration. That means that we need to just have the value back there. But that is the concept of temporal dead zone. So hoisting applies mainly to the var keyword that we mentioned, and also functions and classes, which are functions and classes, a concept we'll cover later on. Then the temporal dead zone here, from what you've seen, applies to the let keyword and the const keyword, because you can't be able to access this. So just think of it as just the time between hoisting of a value and the actual declaration of that value. So that time in between there is the temporal dead zone. And there's a number of differences between the two, just from what you've mentioned, because hoisting moves items on top to the top of the declaration, either to the top of the scope, but the temporal dead zone is just the period that exists, or rather the period where a variable exists but it cannot be accessed, right? And I do hope this has been a bit more clear on what you refer to all this as when you're talking about variables and everything else. Now let's go ahead and look at a few more things as far as variables are defined. So the simple naming rules here is you okay, let's do this down below. The simple naming rules is that you have a declaration, you can choose letter or anything, then you have the name of the variable name. So let's say a variable name is like username, something like that. Then you have a value that is going to be declared to it. So you have a value as name, something like that. So this is just the simple sort of way to put it. To help us understand these concepts of variables and everything else a lot further, we need to talk about data types, and we need to talk about data types in JavaScript. So data types are very, very important. But given that we've spent some time talking about variables here, in the next video, we're going to look at data types in JavaScript.